All right, guys, this one's interesting. Liberal pastor James Talarico went on the Joe Rogan podcast and really dug into Christian hypocrisy. And toward the end, they even brushed up against the Epstein files, where you can actually hear Rogan sounding almost disappointed, like he's finally realizing the hype never matched the reality. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Let's roll it.
The journalism that's been done on Dunn and Wilkes, I think their ultimate goal is a theocracy. And again, this is very personal, given how important my faith is to me, but I'm a Christian, and I think there is no more dangerous form of government than theocracy. Because the only thing worse than a tyrant is a tyrant who thinks they're on a mission from God.
We haven't had any good examples of that in the past.
No.
There's not one that you go, well, that one worked out.
Right. And so this is people trying to use my religion to control people.
Yeah.
That's the name of the game. And we're seeing that here. I mean, I'm an 8th-generation Texan. My family's been here since it was Mexico. I love this state. But I've just seen people like Dunn and Wilkes just take us in this far-right culture war direction at the expense of actual problems we need to solve. One of the bills that didn't pass last legislative session was a bill that would have provided funding for flood mitigation and emergency systems to get the word out when there's a flood. And we literally just saw the consequence of not passing that bill.
See, this is exactly where the cracks start to show. The same right-wing voices who scream all day about big government overreach are suddenly fine with the government acting like a Sunday school teacher. That's the contradiction James is pointing out, and it's hard to argue with. That's not limited government. That's control dressed up as morality. And James isn't speaking as an outsider. He's speaking as a Christian who knows faith doesn't need the state to prop it up. Believe me, this is a video you'll want to see. Let's dive in.
We've always had a separation of church and state. It's been very important. And that this imposing this on kids in school, in non-religious schools, just seems kind of crazy.
Well, and the staunchest defenders for the separation of church and state throughout American history were Protestant Christians, Baptists in particular, right? I mean, the letter Jefferson writes where he first uses that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, was to the Danbury Baptists. Because, I mean, these Protestants were fleeing Europe as religious minorities, right? I mean, this is kind of essential to the founding of this country was religious freedom. And so those Christians understood that once the government starts preaching your religion, starts making decisions about your faith, that doesn't lead anywhere good. So we should be very suspicious of the state usurping the role of pastors and Sunday school teachers. I mean, if you want to deepen your faith, we have churches on every street corner. A lot of them don't have a lot of people in them, right? We've got mosques and temples and synagogues that have a ton of room in them. And so why would we have the government start to teach kids about or preach a certain religion when we have houses of worship that can do that?
Yeah, I think it's also a really important point you made earlier that if you try to force kids into doing things, they don't like to do it.
Correct.
And especially if you try to force kids they're secular and they come from households that maybe are atheists or agnostic, and then you have this on the wall,
right,
and you impose it on them.
Yeah,
they're going to think about it like they think about a lot of other government BS.
As they should.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly think that Christianity has a lot to share with the world at this moment of kind of crisis everywhere. But this, again, is giving Christianity and religious people broadly a bad name. Because this is what people think about religious people, that we're more interested in imposing our faith or our values or our beliefs on others instead of living it out ourselves.
Yeah. What do you think this is in response to? Like, why do you think they're trying to impose this? What would make them want to put this in schools?
I think fear.
Fear.
And I get that fear. I want to acknowledge that I also feel this fear that, I look across my church on Sunday mornings and I see a lot of gray hair. I worry about the future of my church, of my faith in this country. Everyone has seen the charts of declining religious participation and the decline in the number of people who belong to faith.
What do you think that's about?
I think a lot of it is well justified because organized religion has done a lot of damage to people.
Isn't it crazy? Those same conservative influencers who constantly rail against government interference suddenly want the government to moonlight as a religious instructor. Just consider the inconsistency here. These are the same folks who shout, "Stay out of my life, my guns, my finances." But when it comes to faith, they're eager for Uncle Sam to take on the role of a minister. Here's what many overlook. The fiercest advocates for church and state separation in America weren't non-believers. They were Christians, Baptists, Protestants, groups that had experienced being religious minorities. They understood the outsider's perspective and advocated for separation because the moment the government selects a state religion, everyone else gets marginalized. That's why it's so paradoxical when right-wing supporters today claim they're safeguarding Christianity. In truth, they're tarnishing its image, making it seem like religion is about domination instead of devotion. Faith isn't about coercion. You can't compel belief. The more you force it, the more resistance you face. It's similar to telling a teenager they need to adore your music. They'll despise it just to contradict you. Genuine belief spreads through example, not by displaying it prominently on a school wall. History shows that whenever governments attempted to enforce religion, it led not to a resurgence but to a revolt. You can't legislate belief into being. That's like trying to mandate someone to love you. You might get obedience, but you'll never capture their heart. The right's cultural crusaders celebrate this as a triumph, but it's a snare. When religion is wielded as a governmental tool, it ceases to be faith and becomes propaganda. Propaganda isn't inspiriting. It repels. If you're truly invested in preserving faith, you don't tether it to politics. You allow it to flourish independently. That's when it's at its most powerful.
Particularly if we're talking about this country,
churches.
about this country is going to be Christianity, right? Now, you know, in India it may be a conversation about Hindu nationalism, but here the dominant religion is Christianity, and you know, we've seen that too many churches, too many faith leaders have abused that trust. A lot of Gen Z, a lot of my fellow millennials, when they hear me talking about, you know, my faith and how it informs my public service, they're like, I've never heard of this kind of Christianity, right? Like, I was told that if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to hate gay people. If you wanted to be a Christian, you had to want to control women. If you wanted to be a Christian, you had to reject science. And so when Gen Z and when millennials were faced with that choice, it was a pretty easy choice for them, right? They chose their gay friends, they chose women's rights, they chose believing in science. And that, in my opinion, was always a false choice. And in fact, a lot of those positions that I just mentioned are contrary to biblical values, to the teachings of Jesus. And so, you know, there's always going to be progressive Christians and conservative Christians. That's a very healthy debate we should always have. But in this country, it's become synonymous with right-wing politics. So much so that when people hear I'm a Christian politician, they just assume I'm a Republican. I mean, so it's just, I think that has pushed a lot of people away.
So where does that come from? Okay, let's start with gay.
Yeah.
Where does this rejection of gay rights come from?
Well, I think broadly we should say that using religion to control the people is a tale as old as time. Right? I mean, this is powerful stuff.
Right.
It's part of why I made the decision to go to seminary, because I was like, if I'm going to talk about my faith and my beliefs and my values in a public setting or on this podcast when millions of people are going to listen, I better know what I'm talking about. I better be thoughtful in how I approach these things because it has real power on people's lives. And so I think you've seen that from the beginning of the Christian tradition. You've seen it across traditions of those in power, whether it's people with political power, social power in terms of homosexuality, or economic power, using that faith to hurt and control other people.
Here's the thing that really gets to me. The use of religion as a means of control goes back to the dawn of history. Whenever those in authority wish to confine people, they often turn to faith. It's like a master key to human behavior. When someone claims divine backing, suddenly the issue seems to transcend politics and discussion, becoming almost untouchable. Monarchs proclaimed divine rights to rule, and slave owners twisted religious texts to defend their actions. Now, contemporary politicians pull the same stunt in cultural skirmishes. Different people, same strategy. Picture a magician's act. The performer distracts with one hand while executing the real trick with the other. That's exactly how religion is employed here. The public fixates on the bright words God's will. While behind the scenes it's purely about grabbing power, optimizing votes, and exerting control. Faith isn't steering the course, it's simply a mask. That's why the younger crowd is stepping away. They're not turned off by spirituality itself, rather, they're put off by underhanded dealings. When they enter a church only to find political rhetoric instead of messages of love or service, they recognize the facade. They aren't interested in a faith that feels more like a political event than a community built on compassion. So, they walk away. And honestly, who can fault them? Here's the sad part. When faith is wielded as a weapon, it loses the core of its strength. It's akin to turning a stunning musical instrument into a blunt tool. Sure, you can break things with it, but the beauty and harmony? That's lost. Right-wing pundits and their supporters might believe they're upholding Christianity, but they're really just damaging the instrument, and then scratching their heads over why fewer people come to listen. This is the pattern. The more faith is used as a weapon, the more individuals drift away, emptying churches, which only spurs those in charge to impose more control. It's fear consuming fear, with genuine faith crushed in between.
But again, if this was something that really was central to Jesus's ministry, I would think he would have said something about it, right? We have 4 Gospels with tons of teachings from Jesus, and none of them are about this. So I get suspicious when anybody, whether it's a televangelist or a politician, tells me that something is central to my faith when Jesus never talks about it. Mm-hmm. To me, that should, I think, ring alarm bells as to what is the agenda here. What is someone trying to get across? And I think if we're looking at the last 40, 50 years, the religious right has made a concerted effort to make homosexuality and abortion the 2 biggest issues for Christians. And, the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the late 1970s. So this idea that to be a Christian means you have to be anti-gay and anti-abortion, there really is no historical, theological, biblical basis for that opinion.
Well, why are you a Democrat?
Well, my mother, so I told you I was born to a single mom. She was a preacher's daughter from Laredo down on the border. She left home at 19. She moved up to Austin. She met my birth father, who was a high school dropout and had a drinking problem. And that drinking problem sometimes led to being violent with my mother. And there was one night, it was me and mom and my birth father, and he had too much drink and got violent again. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and my mom decided right then and there that she was leaving. So she packed all our stuff. She put me in her little Ford Escort. She drove me to the hotel where she worked downtown. The manager let us stay in one of the rooms for a few weeks until we found a little apartment in East Austin. And mom, she took on double duty at the hotel. She fought for me at every instance, even when it was her own physical safety was at risk. And back then, this was early 90s, she could look over at the Texas Capitol and she saw Texas Democrats like Ann Richards, Bob Bullock, people who fought for the little guy, mm-hmm. for working people who were forgotten and left behind. That was the classic Democratic Party.
Right.
And so I remember when I was maybe kindergarten, and someone in school, they were talking about political parties, and I asked my mom what we were, and she was like, we're Democrats because Democrats fight for the people.
Most politicians go off on some theoretical tangent about party values or ideals, but he gets his perspective from his upbringing. Politics didn't come to him from a classroom, it came from watching his mom work tirelessly to provide for them after leaving a bad situation. That kind of authenticity is rare in politics. What makes him even more appealing is how down-to-earth his reasoning is. He didn't claim, I'm a Democrat because the party is flawless. Instead, he said, I'm a Democrat because when my mom was struggling, those were the folks who stood up for families like mine. It's logical. It links policies to actual life experiences, which has much more credibility than some well-rehearsed speech. Another aspect I admire about him is that he doesn't shy away from his past. Plenty of politicians try to tweak their history to appear tougher or more glamorous. He doesn't. He says, yes, my dad had issues. Yes, my mom worked endless hours. Yes, we stayed in a hotel until we found a place. He embraces it. That kind of honesty speaks volumes because it shows his political stance wasn't chosen out of personal gain but necessity. Plus, there's an element of humility in how he presents it. He doesn't argue that Democrats have all the answers or that Republicans are the problem. He says, these were the people who had our back when no one else did. That sincerity is striking in the political arena, where it's not often found. You don't have to be on board with everything the Democrats propose to recognize that his standpoint is authentically rooted in personal experience.
Perspective is that at the highest levels, it's all being controlled by money, and that's not going to change. You know, like the people that were very hopeful for change when Trump got into office, one of the things that everyone was promised was you're going to find out the Epstein client list, and you're going to find out who killed JFK and what the UFOs were all about. You haven't heard a fucking peep out of any of that shit.
Yeah.
No one knows nothing. And today they just finally said there's no client list, there's no videos. I mean, I had Kash Patel. These people, you know, Kash came on the podcast and said there's nothing that you want to see. You know, this guy,
nothing you need to see.
Dan Bongino, who's always like shouting from the rooftops, we're going to get to the bottom of this and find out who these people are. Everyone's saying, no, Epstein killed himself. No, nothing to see here. And it's like, okay, well, that's why people are cynical. People are cynical because you had all this hope for change. And then you realize, like, oh, the same people that are pulling the strings are still pulling the strings.
Well, and it doesn't help when there are videos of the president, hanging around with
and everybody
Epstein.
else, including Nobel Prize winning scientists.
Yes. Yeah. It's not just limited.
Yeah, I mean, it's that whatever that compromise organization was, whatever that thing was that they were running, whatever this game was, that I'm sure they're running another version of it right now, where they provide experiences to people that have a very difficult time, getting out there and having their fun. And then they compromise them. I mean, I think this is it's a time-honored tactic of control. It's been around forever, and obviously it works. Look, if you have so much interest in getting to the bottom of this, like universally on both sides of the aisle, and yet nothing gets done, that tends to give people this fear that cynicism is the correct perspective.
And I want to validate that there is reason and good reasons to be disillusioned. Mm-hmm. I guess all I'm pushing back on is that second step of it's always going to be this way.
Right. It doesn't have to be this way.
That is the key step.
Right.
So
that's because you need to run for president.
Yeah.
We need someone who's actually a good person.
What was truly striking in that clip was Rogan's tone. He didn't sound like the same guy who once fueled the buzz, the excitement, the belief that monumental events were on the horizon. Back then, the atmosphere buzzed with promises of jaw-dropping revelations, of hidden truths being unearthed, of long-standing systems being unveiled. That kind of talk sparked a lot of energy and optimism, and Rogan reflected that vibe. But now he's different. Not outraged, not ranting, just worn out, resigned. Instead of exuding the something major is about to unfold energy, it was more like, we were promised answers, yet all we get is silence. That's a significant change. It's the sound of someone coming to terms with the fact that the hype train led nowhere. Imagine being all excited for a concert where the band promised to play the tracks fans have been begging to hear for years. You attend, the lights dim, the instruments come out, and they play the same old set list you've heard numerous times. That's the vibe Rogan was giving off, a mix of disappointment and the realization that maybe the grand reveal was never going to happen anyway. Here's the thing people rarely voice openly: the die-hard fans who bought into those promises aren't going to dwell on this moment. They'll keep chattering about the next supposed bombshell just around the bend. They'll continue waiting for the next big announcement, the next hint, the next grand disclosure. But they won't look back and ask, hang on, weren't we promised all this already? It's simple, really, acknowledging that letdown is painful. If they admit that the past promises were unfulfilled, the entire narrative begins to unravel. It's easier to continue chasing the illusion than to stop and see that you've been running in circles. That's why Rogan's change matters. It's unusual to hear someone who once amplified the hype frankly say, we didn't get what we were told we would. The psychology behind this aligns with gambling. Picture someone at a slot machine. They've been losing all night, but with every lever pull they think, all right, the jackpot's on its way, just one more try. They avoid discussing the money they've already lost. Their focus is on the win they believe is just one reel away. This is precisely how the hype cycle operates. Right-wing influencers keep their audiences hooked by continuously hinting at the next big thing, the real truth allegedly about to drop any moment. It keeps audiences engaged, but it simultaneously prevents them from stepping back and asking, wait a minute, we've been waiting for ages. When is this going to happen? So, let me ask you this. Are folks on the right beginning to realize how often they have been led on, or are most still comfortable in the cycle of chasing new promises? I'd love to read your opinions in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.